thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Adrienne Heron. I do the KTT for our project, and I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that we're grateful to live, work, and be in relation with people from across many traditional territories covering all regions of Alberta. And this acknowledgement is to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships and our own understanding of local Indigenous people, their cultures, and their knowledge. And with that, I'll hand it over to Christine Flame.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking your time to be here tonight. We'll just do a quick intro for Norine before we get started. In her nearly 26 years with cows and fish, Norine has focused on working with landowners, communities, and natural resource professionals to help them recognize the value of riparian areas and what they can do to maintain these areas as healthy, productive pieces of our landscape. Her work with community leaders, organizations, and agencies emphasizes sharing lessons learned in effective program design and delivery. She combines wetland ecology research with her farm upbringing to help bridge science, management, and education. She believes strongly that those who manage and use the land are critical to ensuring a healthy landscape. So with that, Norine, please take it away.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to be here tonight. I'm really excited. As you just heard, I work for an organization called Cows and Fish, and many of you may have heard of us before, but for those that haven't, we are a stewardship organization that promotes and fosters knowledge about riparian areas, which I'll talk a little bit more about. That obviously includes grazing. That's sort of a big part of what we do is talk to people about managing these places in with cows. And we are a nonprofit conservation organization. We're a registered charity, and we're really happy to be here to share some of our knowledge. The work that I'm going to talk about is both in our work that we have done with producers across the province, but also some research. So I hope to kind of blend a bunch of sort of practical experience and observations with case studies of producers we've worked with, as well as some science and agricultural research that sort of blends it together with a bit of economics to give you some things, hopefully, that you haven't heard before, or maybe things that you haven't quite thought about from this lens. Maybe you know about them, but you didn't really think about how they relate to managing near water and livestock. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat through the time of the speaking, and we'll do our best to get to all of them at the end. There should be lots of time, hopefully, for questions at the end. So this is a kind of a schematic showing you what a riparian area looks like, in side view. Imagine basically the roots are keeping their feet wet in that elevated water table that's due to the adjacent water body, whether that's a stream, a river, a lake, or a wetland. It's any place that has that extra moisture due to the water body, and they typically have deep, rich soils, and therefore more abundant growth because of those conditions. So they're very important. And one of the reasons or ways that producers influence riparian health, of course, is the vegetation management, and that, of course, relates to grazing. So thinking about how do we influence or change or manage the plants in particular, but also the soil. And in a stream, if you imagine this is a little stream being held together with the vegetation, roots in particular are really important because there's a lot of energy in water, and managing that energy so we don't have excess erosion, for instance, is part of managing the grazing. Other things that riparian areas do is store a lot of water. The water in the channel or in the pond, part of the wetland, or in the lake is only a small fraction. A lot of the water is actually underground in shallow groundwater, and so that hydrology, that's really important storage. So the pictures sort of on the left show you what a healthy riparian area do: store it and then release it when the fall comes or winter. In an unhealthy site, the water runs off and doesn't have that opportunity to soak in and rebuild that groundwater. So that's some of what we would expect a healthy riparian area to do, in addition to provide a lot of diversity for wildlife and fish support of many things. 80% of our wildlife rely on riparian areas, and all fish, because they rely on elements of the land to support their needs in the water. They don't just need water, obviously. And then, of course, why probably many of you are here, in addition to water quality and quantity, forage productivity is very abundant, generally speaking, in riparian areas compared to the adjacent uplands, because there's more moisture and there's often really good soil. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So if we expect riparian areas that are healthy to perform all these functions. How do we get that to happen? And that's, of course, integral to having a successful and productive and sustainable beef production or other livestock management around water bodies. So they're very diverse. If you're in southern Alberta in July and August, it's often really easy to tell what's riparian. It's the only place that's green and everywhere else is very brown. Those of you that are a little further north and west, it's not always as obvious, but it's that interface between the aquatic and the terrestrial where it's a little wetter than dry and drier than wet. It's not the actual water itself that's the lake or the river. It's the stuff adjacent in that floodplain and stream bank that's extra moist. And we know these places have everything cows like or other livestock. They have gravity in their favor. They're at the bottom of whatever, a hill or a slope or a valley. They're always in the low spot, which means to get out of them, you have to climb up and out further. And so they are magnets for livestock in general. And that's why we're talking about them tonight. We do know, of course, that our landscapes across North America evolved with grazing in addition to disturbances like fire. But of course, our modern use of these landscapes is quite different than historically they evolved with over the last 12,000 years in Alberta since glaciation. But we do have some ideas of how they've changed. And this is an example from the Bayou Ranch. Some of you may know it's a provincial or it's a national historic site near Longview, which is southwest of Calgary. The picture on the left shows the creeks there have lots of willows on all parts. And then you go 50 years later and you can see that a lot of those willows have gone missing, and that is a graze situation. And so we do know that sometimes long-term grazing can change the landscape and how it looks and therefore how it functions. And so we maybe don't have those same views as we did in 1947. We have more technology, we have different kinds of grazing practices, but keeping in mind that we have made changes to the landscape inadvertently or on purpose in many cases, without even realizing that we were perhaps removing the function and therefore the sustainability and resilience of these systems. So here's an example of another stream in southern Alberta that is about 100 yards, 100 meters apart, same stream, two different management on the same day. So you can see, even if you aren't a science expert or a grazing expert, that the picture on the right is unraveling. The trees and the shrubs there are not looking so healthy. In fact, they're pretty much all dead. The soil is eroding. The banks are sloughing off. There's not much opportunity for those functions I talked about to happen, including there's a lot of loss of land and forage productivity compared to the site on the left, which has all of those things happening. And they are both graze sites. So it's really about different kinds of grazing strategies that can achieve very different outcomes. I'm going to mostly focus on cows because that's the kind of work we do mostly is with cattle producers, but I will make a few references to other kinds of livestock. And of course, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with them more than I am. But the general concepts I'm going to talk about will certainly apply to all of our grazing and browsing animals. This is just an example of how important it is to understand different livestock. I think this is a shot of cows around a dugout, many of them standing in it, and one lone bison all by itself off a little ways away. Now, he was, or she, I think it's a he, that was the only bison in the paddock. So maybe he wasn't welcomed by the other cows, but I do certainly understand from talking to those that do raise bison that they have a tendency to behave quite differently compared to cows around water and don't spend as much time at it. So knowing your livestock and your particular situation, of course, is really important to applying the preferences and needs that you have. So let's jump in. What are the kind of overarching principles? And these apply to riparian areas as well as any other kind of grazing, whether it's in a forest, in a grassland, tame pasture, native pasture. You want to balance supply and demand. Really, that means your stocking rate and carrying capacities have to be in line with the production. And you want to have good distribution. You want to avoid the vulnerable periods, which vary depending on where you're at and what your pasture's like. And you want to provide effective rest. Plants have to rest after grazing so they can grow again for the next time. And that means grazing has to allow rest during the growing season. During droughts or during winter, obviously, plants aren't recuperating, so they need rest during the growing season to recuperate. So kind of like a simple economics analogy, if we're grazing and want to stay within our appropriate stocking rate and carrying capacity, we need to leave the capital and use only the interest, leaving that litter or carryover and other parts of the plants so they can regrow for the next time, and of course replenish the root reserves as well. So some of you may have done litter collection. If you aren't familiar with them, I really encourage you to look up the Range Plant Community Guides. They're available for all of the communities across Alberta, plant communities, and all the natural regions, sub-regions that give tons of information on all the different kinds of grazing plant communities you might find, recommended stocking rates and carrying capacities. Whether you're on public land or private land, they're really useful guides to help you understand the kind of plant communities that you might find out there, and how to compare your own, stocking rates and carrying capacities. When we have healthy riparian areas, they're lush and abundant, and there's lots of diverse growth. And that's, of course, what we want, not only because it's great for the ecosystem and for riparian areas and fish and wildlife and water quality, but it also means they produce a lot more forage. Healthy riparian areas definitely produce more forage, and depending on where you are, of course, riparian areas can produce 2 to 10 times as much as the adjoining upland, because they do tend to have extra moisture, and they have been accumulating over thousands of years soils that also allow them to be more productive. So they're really important parts of our forage base that we want to be productive into the future, of course. When they're not that healthy or not that productive, you'll see signs of extra erosion on the stream banks, lots of bare ground, weeds, the trees and the shrubs are not regenerating, they're disappearing. The white in that top photo is lots of oxeye daisy, which of course is not a great plant to have all over your pastures. So you start to see these kinds of symptoms when a riparian area is not healthy. So what are the ways to, aside from balance, is providing rest? Sometimes we have, in some cases, you have the right overall stocking rate and carrying capacity, but cows being cows, if they get to make all the decisions and spend all their time in their favorite spots, they overuse certain areas, and that does tend to be riparian areas because those are the magnet places. So looking at different kinds of ways of adding rest, different kinds of rotation, complementary grazing, so using tame pastures, deferring rotation, or deferring use of your riparian areas till they're a little more dry. All of those are different kinds of rotation, basically. A rotation just needs 2 pastures. You might have 50 and do high intensity rapid rotation. I would say in general, it's not that easy to do a high intensity rapid rotation grazing in a riparian area with native species, because it tends to be very difficult to maintain those. That doesn't mean you can't do small paddock rapid rotation, but typically higher intensity is much more risky and more challenging in a riparian area because, of course, of the wet soils. So rotation is, just finding a way to move cattle between pastures and having more than one of them, different times a year, different parts of the season, growing season, whatever it is you're grazing. If you're year-round grazing, then, of course, having those capacities as well. So I'm going to sprinkle a few examples through my talk. And this is just one of the sites we worked with, a producer, kind of, say, Vermilion-ish country. This is a wetland that was being winter fed by. And so the cows, of course, spent lots of time there. You can see some of the kind of bedding and feed material on the left that was left, and they recognized that they wanted this wetland to be healthier than it was, and so they did exclude grazing, and you can see that in 5 years it went from 70% to 84% health. So it really rebounded with just some multi-years of rest. Now sometimes rest is just part of a growing season. Sometimes it can be multiple years. Maybe it's intended to be permanent. There's no right or wrong. There's just lots of different ways to achieve rest, of course. The other thing that is one of the key principles is to avoid those sensitive periods. The picture on the left, you might know, is called pugging and hummocking. Some people call it turtlebacks. Basically, hoof action caused the soil to get compacted in the low spots and pushed up the soil beside it. So you get these humps and bumps. And that compacted soil doesn't hold as much water. It doesn't grow the same kind of plants. And of course, therefore, it's not as productive, and it's not as drought or flood tolerant either. So avoiding being in these riparian areas, and wetlands are particularly so sensitive to them when they're really soft and compactable, is one of the sensitive periods. The other time in the spring that's a concern is it's shown on the picture on the right, where you have flood events. So even though the trees and shrubs, the willows that Gerald is standing beside, haven't really leafed out yet. They're trapping a lot of sediment. They're preventing erosion. So they're really important, even in early season, to have those riparian plants present to do that kind of physical protection in runoff and flood events. So those are a couple times to think about. The other time to think about is just that different pastures have different needs. So a tame pasture and a forest have different needs, but so do the bottomlands and the things at the top of the slope, at the top of the valley. And so thinking about the type of pasture, the kind of plants you have, and the timing, and like when different plants are more sensitive. In general, native plants are more sensitive early in the season, compared to tame pastures can often take a little earlier grazing without harm. And so that's something to think about. This is a shot in the prairies. You can see that also in the fall or even in drought settings, once the grasses in the uplands start to dry off, sometimes the only green thing left, and sometimes the only forage left, especially in drought conditions when there hasn't been a lot of productivity, is in the bottomlands, in those riparian areas. And so again, watching for that sensitive timing of and potential overuse during those periods. And that can include winter use. Even though leaves fall off, say all these willows and chokecherries, they're still really palatable and highly nutritious, and cattle do know that. So watching for that late season use and kind of recognizing that they will start to seek out trees and shrubs more. And if you're trying to keep your trees and shrubs, obviously that's something just to keep an eye on. One of the other sensitive periods I mentioned, of course, is that spring use, so avoiding that soft, wet soils. Well, this is a producer we worked with in the kind of St. Paul country, Bonnyville area, and he had these huge wetlands which were ringed with poplars, but the whole wetland was basically damp and wet. And he decided to do dormant season grazing, which basically meant when they were frozen, and because otherwise they're just soft and wet all the time, and he couldn't really get in there readily without causing that physical compaction issue. So one of the things he had to watch for, though, of course, was that use on those willows. And they did some forage sampling and found out that the native grasses and sedges, which he's standing in there, had really good overall nutritional value in the winter, but the cattle certainly were supplementing their nutrition by eating the willows, which were, of course, naked and didn't have leaves at that time, but did add a lot of protein value. So kind of watching the amount of that happens is part of balancing that timing and sensitive period. And he did manage with that kind of technique in dormant season grazing when it was frozen to avoid this kind of compaction. If you think of these places as really important sponges to hold a lot of water, you want them to hold water so that when water's scarce, of course, that water is there to grow plants as well as contribute to the water body itself. But if we squeeze that sponge and compact it, it can't hold that water. So it runs off and doesn't have that chance to soak in and be there when it's needed later. We're kind of in this kind of time frame right now, that early spring, late winter, when soils are starting to thaw, and there's often a lot of either wintering or calving in low areas where there's some shelter. And so the other thing to watch for is, of course, just that physical aspect of not just the soils, but rubbing and just physical activity around the trees and the shrubs, in this case the willows. Just keeping an eye on that if you want to keep that shelter for the long term, managing the amount of use around it so it is sustained. And by that I mean the natural willows. So there's all kinds of distribution techniques, and I'm going to talk about quite a few of them, and they all weave together with other techniques. So if you're balancing your stocking rate and carrying capacity, you're adding rest, or you're avoiding sensitive periods, or you're applying distribution, it's really not that you're doing any one thing by itself most of the time, because you're weaving together those four principles. But I'll kind of frame these as distribution techniques, but keeping in mind that they're part of achieving all of those four things in varying ways. Now, we don't always want even distribution. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we just want uneven distribution on purpose. And so whatever your situation is planning that distribution so the cows don't get to make all the choices of where they spend their time. So think about your riparian area in particular, for the reasons I talked about, the sensitive features of it, as kind of like a drive-through. Pick up their lunch, eat, graze, and continue or move on, so to speak. So there's a lot of different techniques, and I'll touch on some of these kinds of ideas, and get you to think about what are the ones that you're using already or that you could add to your suite of different choices. So this is an example of a situation where if you have a small paddock or a pasture, often they're the ones that are near the yard. They're the holding field where you have, maybe they're the calving field that's small. Maybe they're where the sick animals or the older animals or the ones that are going to go to market are staying close to the house. They're not necessarily a grazable pasture. They're a small unit, and sometimes that means they are actually more like a parking lot. And so keeping in mind that not every pasture can be grazed sustainably. Sometimes they can't be. They're too small, and so you need to just think about providing that supplemental feed and treating that. It's not really a grazing plan as much as some other kind of approach. So feel free to put this in the chat and just think about this for a second. What are the top 2 attractants that influence where cattle spend their time the most? The top 2 attractants. So think about this. Feel free to put it in the chat. Just give people a second to think about it. You probably know this. Number 1, water. Obviously, cows have to have water to live, and watering systems or water sources are the number 1 thing that influences where they spend their time. And the second, most important, is actually shade or shelter. And obviously, it depends on the time of year, what they're using it for, but places that have shade or shelter are where the heaviest manure buildup is, within 30 meters of that. So whether it's windbreaks, patches of trees, a few spare willows, and because a lot of times that's where there are trees and shrubs in your riparian areas, that's also where they're going to spend extra time because they want that shelter aspect. So keeping in mind that if you're trying to keep that shade and that shelter feature, in addition for things for the riparian area for your livestock, you want to really watch how much time they're spending in those favored places. And distributing or controlling these 2 and other distribution pieces is really important to change how they spend their time. So this is just a series of shots that shows some interaction we did a number of years ago. This is a public land actually up in the Tullabee Lake area, so northeast of St. Paul. And it actually shows drove trails. This is public land where there were tame pasture blocks basically created, and there was a lot of natural water bodies and wetlands you can see. And in order to basically encourage the livestock to not just hang out in the tame pasture blocks and on the shorelines, they basically created drove trails or paths through the forest to encourage distribution and movement across this rather large landscape. So there's lots of different techniques, and this certainly isn't riparian specific, but just one of those kinds of things that you don't hear about or talk too much about, but might be applicable in your situation. We worked with a producer in the foothills. You can see on the left this tiny little ephemeral draw, barely a stream. He wanted to just reduce the crossing spots and the bare soil that he was seeing, and he put in this basically pre-used wooden rig mat, and within a day the cattle were crossing it and not crossing right beside it. There you can see where it was bare soil. It cost very little. It was super simple, and immediately the cattle took to that technique, which was great because they do like good footing as a general rule. And of course this stream does eventually contribute to other little stream which end up being fish habitat. So he was quite happy that they so readily took to this technique, and it was extremely simple. The picture on the right shows a more elevated crossing. It looks a bit more like a boardwalk, but that's not quite what it looks like on the ground. They use some wings to encourage cattle to their favorite crossing already, and it certainly was a spot that got used. We have been part of some sites that are up in the Peace region, and they've done some really elevated crossings where they're more like a bridge, but they're not a bridge big enough for a vehicle to go across. And there can be some challenges just with noise or view through the slats, let's say, or out the sides. So just making sure that you're thinking about those kinds of things and planning for them to get the best effect of using these kinds of things if you're using crossings like this. Now, sometimes you give all the advice you want to your livestock and they don't listen. So, thinking about how they behave and why they behave the way they do and kind of trying to outsmart a cow or a horse should be doable for all of us, of course. But just kind of keeping in mind that they're just creatures of habit and of certain kinds of behaviors. And so, hopefully, some of the things I'm going to talk about next will just emphasize how we need to think about their behavior and factor it into our grazing strategies. And a big part of that, of course, is things like using offsite watering systems rather than going to the water body itself. Even when you put the exact same water that they would drink into that trough, it is a preferred option for them. And this is some work that was done by Doug Vera with Ag Canada many years ago in BC. He did a whole bunch of different projects, but this one looked at the number of head, as the number of head increased in this, as the cows were calving, that's the red line at the top. They started off, everybody that came into the pasture was using the offsite watering system. And as time went on, which is moving to the right, there was more head, obviously, as more cows were put in with their calves, and it declined a little bit, but it still stayed above 80% of all of the drinking was still happening at the troughs and the trough that was provided. So, and that's a pretty common, there's been research across North America in a variety of situations that 80% is pretty much the minimum. You can certainly expect more, but it's pretty much a standard expectation that even with open access to the water body, the cattle will choose the trough 80% of the time, and often more. As in this study, it on average it was, or on the total, it was over 90%, but at least 80%, which is a good thing because that reduces the amount of time they're spending in the water body, obviously. This is a shot of some of the work that Doug Veer did on another project on a small stream that just shows it's really important to put your trough in the right place. So those yellow dots show a couple trough locations. And one trough, which is the more left and upper one, has lots of blue lines through it. And that's because those were the lines, they did some collar work on the cattle. That was already a favorite trail, basically, and that trough got tons of use. The trough that's on the bottom right, that's the yellow dot, got very little use because it had very little cattle accessing that general area, and they just didn't go and use it much. So thinking about where to put your troughs, kind of using favorite sites or favorite pathways already is important, but always looking to maximize the benefit of your distribution tool and put it away from the channel edge or the shoreline as far as you can, because the further you put it away, the more distribution value you will get. And they not only spend more time at drinking out of that, but it also changes where they spend their time grazing. So some of the work that Doug Vera showed was that you kind of influence their grazing within about 300 meters. And obviously it's going to depend on your situation, but some of his work showed that 300 meter sort of donut around your troughs also had different grazing intensity. So again, thinking about where do you want them to spend their time, both drinking, but also grazing. So moving to some other behavioral stuff, some of you may have seen this work, which was done in the States with Dr. Derek Bailey. And he basically wanted to see how much they could change where cattle spent their time by herding them or herding them with adding strategically placed supplements. And so it's big hill, sort of small mountain country. The cattle in the pink dots are basically doing whatever they want. They're put in the pasture, and you can see they hang out in very defined places, which just happen to be riparian areas mostly. The other cattle, which are the blue dots and the yellowy dots or shapes, were those that were herded and had supplement. And they spent a lot more time better distributed across the pasture, and they spent a lot less time in the riparian area. So they're grazing more consistently and widespread, which is making better use of the rest of the pasture. And they're also not overusing their favorite sites as much, which tend to be the riparian areas. So there was a significant reduction in the amount of time with the herding and supplementation compared to the site where they let the cows do what they wanted. And the other thing that they checked was that the actual riparian stubble height, so the remaining height of the vegetation in the riparian area, was also significantly taller in those sites that they did herding. So they didn't change the number of cattle, they didn't change the acreage, they just changed how the distribution was using what was available to them. So really important to recognize sometimes it's about distribution and access to areas or how they're spending their time, not just about how many head or how long they're in there for. One of the most important things, in addition to obviously shade and shelter and water, is supplement, and that often is mineral or salt. And there's a real common misconception that we should have our salt near our water for cattle, but really the cattle behavior research shows that's not the case. If you do that, they come to the same spot twice because they take salt and water separately in a lot of cases, and that means they actually come back to the same spot twice. So putting the salt somewhere else is really more important than putting it at the water itself, because you're actually increasing intensity if you put it close together. So this is, to me, one of the things that's like really interesting. It's not new, but I've yet to hear anybody in Alberta, and please be the first person to tell me tonight, that you have done some cattle breeds and selection work based on how your cattle behave. And I don't mean the ones that would, chase you over the fence, or that are good mothers or bad feet or whatever the genetics are of the other things, but is how they spend their time in your pasture. So who's doing that? So this is some great work that, again, was done in the States, looking at Tarantays, which are from the Alps, and Herefords, which are from England, and then crosses in between. And they basically, the kind of classic answer is that they found that there are Tarantays are hill climbers and the Herefords are bottom dwellers. And the bottom dwellers are in purple dots, and the hill climbers, as you can see, are on the tops of the mountains. And so I really think this is an underutilized selection technique. It doesn't have to be breed specific. It can be individual specific. And that some of your animals are more hill climbers, and some are more bottom dwellers, some are more adventurous, some are not. So really looking at those opportunities to just do herd selection and in a way that would support that, especially if you have a lot of diverse and terrain and a lot of elevation. And that's partly also about which mothers you keep, and therefore which calves you keep that are theirs, because you can learn the cows teach their young a lot, both on what their favorite things are to eat, but also on where to spend their time. So looking at that kind of as a not just on body conformation or rate of gain, but thinking about the other behavioral traits that maybe aren't top of mind. So they do influence their diet, but also where they spend their time. And we know, and I'm sure many of you know, that the picture on the top right is your typical young animals. They're climbing all over everything. They're more adventurous compared to the cow-calf, especially with young calves. They're not typically covering the same kind of steep slopes as younger animals would be. So thinking about age and class, if you have that option, maybe your heifers or your steers, your yearlings go into a different part of the pasture than you want your cow-calves, and just in terms of where you want them to spend their time and be distributed. We worked with a producer that didn't use the breed thing, but more like the distribution of where they like to spend their time. And that was based on turn-in locations. Some research, and I'm sure many of your observations show this too, where you put them in, they're always going back to that spot over and over. And so in a riparian pasture, especially if it's not that big, or if it's leading to specific repeat trails and crossings, it's really great to put in different turn-in locations or different exit points. So you actually have multiple gates, multiple opportunities. And of course, this works in a riparian area as well as a non-riparian area. But if you're doing it in a riparian area, you can think about like where are they crossing to get to those turn-in or turn-out locations, and minimize the crossings on the creek, for instance. But you might decide that you also want to exclude cattle from your riparian area, and that's certainly a strategy that we're seeing way more than we used to in the past. A lot of producers say to us, it's just so much easier. They don't get stuck. They don't fall in the ice. They don't do things that I don't want them to do. I just know exactly where they are. They're easier to move. They're not hiding in the bush. And so that's definitely an option, depending what your goals and what you're trying to achieve are. But some things to think about if you're doing exclusion fencing, so keeping the cattle out, and whether that's permanent or temporary fencing, is these pictures. So picture on the left is an exclusion fence along a little creek in Willow Valley, where the family was looking to try to create more regeneration of the willows. They'd kind of gone missing. It's a native trout stream, and the creek was needing some improvement, and they recognized this many decades ago. And the unfortunate thing is, you can see my colleague at the time, Greg, who some of you know, he's well over 6 feet, and the reed canary grass was taller than him. And all that really grew back was lots more reed canary grass. So not only didn't other stuff have the ability to regenerate, the willows could not compete because there was so much litter. Then they, not grazing it for many, many years at a time, they ended up with a lot of litter. And that litter led to more Canada thistle starting. And because they'd fenced it very narrowly, they also couldn't get in there and graze it lightly or heavily or at all, because basically the banks were right tight up against the fence itself. And so they have since, as the fences have gotten older and needed replaced, they've actually put the fence further back so they create more like what's on the right, something that's more of a narrow grazable corridor. So if they need to and when they want to, they have that more defined control, and they don't have, in this case, either tame grasses or things like reed canary grass that are very, very strong and prolific growers, causing other problems that they didn't want, like lots of litter buildup with weed problems, and preventing the native species from coming back. So some things to think about if you're doing exclusion fencing. The other thing, of course, is where's your flood line if you're on a stream or a river, or even a lake or wetland, but making sure your fence isn't going to get, covered in logs, jams coming down and rip it out, or whatever that might look like in your neck of the woods, making sure your fence is a little further back so you don't have constant fence repairs. And it doesn't have to be permanent. It might be temporary. It might be repeated. Pigtail, electric fence, a lot of portable systems are really handy these days. They can be reused in multiple places. And then they move on to a new place. You don't have obviously trees falling on them. You don't have wildlife going through them. So there's lots of potential benefits. This is a site in the Cochrane area where they decided they did want to see some recovery of their little stream. And you can see the middle picture, a lot of growth has started to happen. The channels start to tighten up. It's captured lots of soil runoff. It's starting to heal. And over many more years, it's starting to look really, really quite good. The willows haven't really bounced back, and the little birches as much as they had hoped. They're certainly coming back, but slower. And once they start to proliferate, fortunately for the stream, or unfortunately, depending how you want to look at it, the beavers say, "Hey, great, you grew some willows for me." And these ranchers have said that that's okay, because they'll keep growing back. That's what willows do. And so they've converted some of their temporary fencing now to permanent, just because they've decided not to graze in these areas. So every situation is different. But you might also want to fence out a riparian area in a way that it's going to be a defined pasture. So the kinds of stuff in it are defined by not the quarter section line, but rather the plant communities or the geography, or some combination, because that's better suited to when you can manage that particular pasture. So this is an example of doing that. And lots of people are doing riparian pastures. This is a situation where you either have crop or sometimes maybe forages next to your stream, and the stream is your primary grazing area in this shot. This is near Toefield, so east of Edmonton a ways. And one thing Lyle has really done in this site is really been cognizant that he wants to keep the trees and shrubs because they are his shelter, and he also values them for the wildlife and the habitat protection, the bank holding capacity. So he's always looking at how much use is happening on the trees and shrubs. And if there starts to be a lot of use on the trees and shrubs, that's kind of his clue of, I think it's time to move. And because there's lots of abundant forage, there's lots of actual grass. It's more the things that are less abundant or that have more risk of being overused, which is the willows that are preferred, or the dogwood, that he wants to keep his eye on. So that's something to think about if you're doing a riparian pasture in a grazing setting. The other thing to think about is whatever you do, think about it as something that can evolve. It's not like it's perfect the first time or it achieves everything you wanted right away. Sometimes you have to keep tweaking and adjusting. And this is a good example of that. This is south of Pincher Creek. And you can see it's a very gravelly system, lots of kind of natural rock and cobble. And it had been grazed for a long, long time. And it was pretty unhealthy in 2000 when we did a health inventory there. You can see it scored 30%. It had a lot of bare ground, not many trees and shrubs, mostly disturbance species, lots of weeds. So they made some pretty significant changes. They reduced their overall grazing at first, and then they continued to adjust it. They were using it in the winter because it's quite close to a yard site and quite handy, obviously, and there is flowing water. But they took out that winter grazing, got rid of winter grazing, and then they continued to improve. And they continue to evolve further. They actually still were seeing that it wasn't rebounding as fast as they thought it should or could. And so they reduced the total number of cows using the site. And you can see in 11 years, it went from 30% to 82% healthy. So that's not going to be true for every site, but they continue to adapt and change. And they saw massive results. And not only does the forage improve, but so does the shelter and obviously all the other non-grazing values like wildlife. And this is got fish in it and lots of wildlife value too. So lots of great reasons to continue to adapt and in their case, continue to graze it successfully. One of the things that I want you to think about is what are the clues on your place? Like what are the signs or what are the key features? Many of you and across Alberta will have this plant, which is red osier dogwood. So it's kind of like, looks like a willow. It's often in the same places, but it's really red bark, has white berries, flowers are white in a cluster. It's the ice cream plant that all livestock like to eat. Pretty much all wildlife that eat shrubs like to eat it. So if you have it, it's a great indicator species that you're doing good stuff. If you're starting to see really heavy browse, like somebody took a tree trimmer to it and it's getting pretty heavily used, or if it's disappearing and there's only a few of them left, those are good indicator species to watch for in your riparian area because they tell you something about like the long-term grazing management to consider. So what are your benefits? Well, everybody I think knows the importance of water for livestock and that water influences the health of them, but that's because the more water they drink, the better the quality of the water they drink, they put more rate of gain on. And this is obviously for, maybe not your cows, it's your calves and your yearlings that you're trying to sell for beef. But if you look at the research shows anywhere from 5 to 23% rate of gain improvement with cleaner water. And that's, again, the water is basically going to be the same water, whether they take it out of the stream or the wetland or the pond, or they drink it out of the trough, but it's still cleaner because they're not mucking about in it. They're not obviously pooping and peeing in it. So it's cleaner and they drink more. So they gain more. And if they do that, some conservative estimates, even if you pick the lowest rate of gain from all the research is 5%. And if you assume cattle prices are nowhere near what they were this last two falls, and only they were $1.75 per pound, and you gain 25 more pounds a head, which we know is easily doable, you quickly pay for a watering system because that makes more money. And so these are also really great benefits and healthier cattle, in addition to, pay off your capital items more quickly. Cleaner water is, of course, means you have healthier cattle and less vet bills. It's obviously great for the ecosystem, fish and other aquatic life, and downstream water drinkers like all of us. We all drink water from somewhere. And it also means your pastures in general are going to be healthier, more resilient, and they're going to have less weeds. They're going to have less bare ground, less erosion. And as we see more droughts, maybe more floods, more erratic weather, we need our pastures to be resilient. And so part of that is, of course, resilience, both in your riparian area, but also in your upland, because everything you do in one area obviously affects the other. So having healthier pastures is a great future planning strategy. So I hope, if anything you took from it isn't put in a water, it's if I put in a water, what am I doing it for? This is a good example of water is not the answer, or any particular practice is not the answer. If I want better distribution, what should I do? Don't put it on top of the stream. That's what this shows. Pick something that will achieve whatever the outcome is you're trying to achieve. Make it practical and economical, and it'll last and it'll be successful. And I encourage you, for those of you who are interested, we have lots of great materials in writing as well as digital on our website, and we do lots of field days and hands-on work. There's a number of grazing schools, pasture courses, so attend something, whether we're involved or many other people, many other partners we work with across the province are always putting on these kinds of events to help. You tune your eye to what kind of grass you got, what kind of things to look for. Is it healthy? Is it maybe needing some work? So I encourage you to attend those if you can. I always have to thank our members and supporters. Cows and Fish started over 30 years ago with a handshake agreement between the Alberta Beef Producers and Trout Unlimited Canada, who are now Freshwater Conservation Canada. And we rely on all these partners as part of our board. And I'm happy to take questions if we have time, which I think we do.
Thanks, Noreen. That was fantastic. We do have a couple of questions. The first one is, what are some strategies to address compaction? Can that really bumpy ground be restored to some extent?
Yeah, it is really tough for people who are along streams and rivers. One of your best strategy is wait for a flood, and I do seriously actually mean that because basically what happens is it gets buried. New material gets brought in, fills it in. Those people that are along lakes and wetlands that have issues, it's a slower process, and it's basically, and it's true everywhere. You need frost heaving, you need root action, and just natural litter buildup. So you have organic matter starting to fill in the low spots. I would definitely not recommend going out there with tillage equipment or heavy other equipment. We have had people ask if that's a bit, but then you kind of, the good stuff that's still there, you're undoing. So I would definitely discourage anybody from doing that, and give it time. It didn't get that way overnight, and it won't return to something different overnight either. Sometimes we've been grazing these places with modern livestock for over 100 years, 120 or 50 years. So it won't change overnight either.
Anna would like to know, could you comment on the feces and urine from livestock that can enter water bodies like wetlands? Are there any concerns about nutrient redistribution?
Yeah, I mean, as a general good practice, we don't want nutrient from livestock or crops, for that matter. If it's inputs that we're adding, we don't want them ending up in our water bodies. They're pollutants in the water. They add nutrients that are not needed. They add which means there's more algal growth or plants that shouldn't be growing in our water bodies. In some cases, obviously that means that the nutrients get used up, and we also reduce the oxygen in our water bodies, which is not great for aquatic life. So, and downstream water quality plants drinking water is not good for that either. We don't want E. coli. We don't want other nutrients that come from livestock, nutrients or bacteria ending up downstream. They're nutrients on land or fertilizer for the plants, but they're not. We don't want that fertilizer in the water.
Perfect. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions for Noreen, to pop them into the chat or into the Q&A. Val I would like to know, I'm curious where to find range plant community guides, and also where to look for used rig mats in the Calgary area.
I don't have an answer on used rig mats. I think this is a bit like the used tire troughs. They're actually like mining tires, and those big tires are being used for water troughs in a lot of places. There's higher demand. There's getting to be higher demand as people realize they're great techniques to use. So I don't have an absolute answer on where to find those. Maybe somebody in the chat could help you.
Yeah, Kijiji or Facebook Marketplace.
Yeah. Put the word out. I'm just actually, I was just actually clicking on the link to put in the link for the range classification tools. They are on.
If you want to share it with me, and I'll do a follow-up email with everyone who's registered with a link to the webinar that we've recorded tonight. So if people want to watch it again, then we'll share any of your resources to everyone directly.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, there's lots of excellent resources, and there's some pretty simple things. You could literally collect your own forage. You can collect your own litter if you want to, and dry it in the oven. Just don't burn it. Do it on low. If you have a kitchen scale, somebody in your household, somebody in your family, you can do some basic measurements and do conversions to figure out how much forage you have being produced, how much litter you have left from last year before you start again. Like, there's some really simple things if you don't already know how to do those, or those people that have public land, that stuff's already being kind of determined for you. So you can work with your public land agrologist, of course. But yeah, lots of great tools. And that's true whether you're on tame pasture or forest. They all have stocking and carrying capacities that are suitable, just different.
AJ is wondering, is virtual fencing effective for riparian exclusion, or is the draw to water and the shade too strong?
There's still not a ton of research out there, but there is some growing on virtual fencing, which is basically collaring the cattle so they don't go where you want, like dogs, directing them with their collar. My understanding is it's totally effective. And you absolutely can get them to go to the right place. Invisible fences, invisible gates that don't really exist. It's think the issue or the limiting factor is just still satellite and cellular coverage, depending on the technology. And of course, the devices themselves are, cost a fair bit per animal if you need one for every animal. But my impression is they are extremely effective as long as you've got the technology and either satellite or cellular coverage that they can work with for moving them wherever you want, including changing the line today from tomorrow. You let them go one day, the next day you decide they don't.
Perfect. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and you've done such a wonderful job of explaining the excellent work that you do. We'd like to thank you so much for taking your time this evening and sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Norine. And thanks
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Have a good one.
Thanks, Norine.